depression. Eventually, he succumbed to tuberculosis. The great German playwright Friedrich Schiller produced his plays about liberty while he suffered from severe asthma, tuberculosis, liver, and heart disease. The last 9 years of his life, when he was practically an invalid, were his most productive. Schiller wrote one play about liberating the Swiss, which is Wilhelm Tell, another about liberating the Dutch, which is Don Carlos, and yet another about liberating the French, which was the Maid of Orleans. "It is not easy to stop," wrote Thomas Mann, "once I have begun to speak of Schiller's special greatness, a generous, lofty, flaming, inspiring grandeur, Schiller's mighty talent, his libertarian sentiments. He is a poet who knows how to bring tears to our eyes while at the same time rousing our indignation against despotism." Cornell University historian Stanley Itzerda wrote this about the Frenchman known as the hero of two worlds. Lafayette knew only one cause during his long lifetime: human liberty. As a young man, he risked his life in war and revolution for that cause. In middle age, living under the barely concealed dictatorship of Napoleon.
Election has been to my co-author, John Hyde, and I in the preparation of this work, and I'm very pleased to see here with us Earl Rogers, who's the outstanding curator of that collection and has done such a superb job for the country and for future scholars. I appreciate it very much, Earl. Glad you're here. As Julie suggested, in 1965, I was in my first year in the Congress, and Henry Wallace died in November of that year. And I'd come from a very strong Republican family in Cedar Rapids. My father was a Taft delegate in 1952, and I even drove Herbert Hoover to his 80th birthday at West Branch at the request of the Republican national chairman, the former one, Harrison Spangler, who lived across the street. And I remember in 1948, when I was in high school, and I went out in the front yard to pick up the morning newspaper after the election and saw that headline. And I ran up to my dad, who was still in bed and had gone to sleep, mercifully believing that Dewey was the next president. And I said, Dad, Truman won. And my father looked up in bed and he said, "John, that's nothing to even laugh about." So coming from that background, you can understand that Franklin Roosevelt's name wasn't mentioned all that often, and frankly, not all that favorably when it was in my home here in Iowa, and Henry Wallace, surprisingly, virtually not at all. And so when I was asked in 1965 to make a comment along with other members of the Iowa delegation, I really had to go look up and see who this man was. And when I did, I was struck by two things. One, what an extraordinary life he had led and was so accomplished in so many diverse fields and achievements. And secondly, how little, if anything, had been written about him other than the ill-doomed 1948 presidential campaign in which he was involved. And I sort of made a decision at that time, now 35 years ago, that someday I'd like to tell his story, because I don't really believe the history of that period is complete without the views and thoughts of Henry Wallace, who left no memoir and who left many of the materials we had access to sealed till long after his death, and other materials that the family, although it was not an authorized biography, generously made available to us for the first time from their family collections. I thought I would talk a little bit tonight about some things and read a little bit from our book, and then I would be delighted to answer questions any of you have, and also to sign the books that many of you have been kind enough to buy this evening. A British journalist visiting this country, before I start, many of you know here, this picture, of course, of Wallace is painted by Grant Wood, another famous Iowan from Anamosa, Iowa, and spent most of his life in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City, as you know. And this was on the cover of Time magazine, September 1938, when he was being considered as a real possibility for president of the United States at that time, where people assumed that President Roosevelt would not seek a third term. A British journalist visiting this country once remarked to an American colleague, "Your Henry Wallace is quite a singular person." "No," the American replied, "Henry Wallace is plural." Indeed he was. No American public figure of the 20th century had such a broad range of talents and interests or demonstrated expertise in so many fields. Wallace was, as Julie has suggested, by turn a scientist and a philosopher, a statistician and an economist, a businessman and a scholar. He was insatiably curious about all manner of things: religion, boomerangs, nutrition, chickens, languages, weather, strawberries, tennis, and radioactivity. You name it, Henry A. Wallace had probably thought about it, read about it, and maybe even written a book or an article about it. He wrote more than a dozen books, ranging from the first econometric study published by an American, to a textbook on corn growing, to books on religion, public policy, and constitutional theory. He wrote scores of speeches, hundreds of newspaper and magazine articles, and thousands of letters. The University of Iowa Library alone here in Iowa City houses some 25,000 letters that John Hyde and I had access to that came both to Henry Wallace and were sent by him. And somehow, amidst this very busy life, Wallace found time to be the editor of two important publications, The Wallace's Farmer and, of course, The New Republic, later in his life, to found the world's first and still largest hybrid seed company, to serve as Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, Vice President of the United States, and run for president as the candidate of the Progressive Party in 1948. Here from our book, American Dreamer, is a snapshot of Wallace at age 50, at the height of his extraordinary tenure as United States Secretary of Agriculture during the Roosevelt first two terms. At the Agriculture Department, he presided over a yeasty environment that gloried in intellectual curiosity and playful eccentricity. When Wallace was in town, he almost always ate lunch in a room beside the main cafeteria where place settings and tablecloths were provided for an additional 10 cents per plate. There, Wallace and his aides would boisterously argue about everything from genetics to geography. Once a week, a language tutor came, and they spoke only in Spanish. And jokers called the noontime gathering the Sex Club, SEC''S. The luncheons were rowdy, free-for-all affairs, sometimes going far afield from agriculture. The unorthodox economist Mariner Eccles, the famed defense attorney Clarence Darrow, and poet and theosophist George W. Russell, writer Sherwood Anderson, and poet Robert Frost, all of them came to Secretary Wallace's table in those years. Wallace reveled in physical activity. Indian wrestling, among other things, interested him, and more than one surprised reporter found himself on the floor after questioning Wallace's prowess. He still played tennis with graceless abandon, shifting his racket from left hand to the right as it suited him. But it was his busy mind that most characterized him to associates. He was always wondering, always questioning, always pressing in unexpected directions. Wallace was as close to being a Renaissance man as anyone in American public life since Thomas Jefferson. That was the judgment of his chief aide, Paul Appleby, who once told that to his daughter. Gove Hambidge, the scholarly editor of the Agriculture Department's yearbooks during the 1930s, spoke in his memoirs of Wallace's, quote, deep interest in an extraordinary range of scientific problems. Wallace's approach to scientific questions, said Hambidge, is usually fresh, bold, and unconventional. He rather enjoys making fun of the cautiousness of the average scientist. On occasional Saturday afternoons, Wallace would drop by Hambidge's home in the Maryland suburbs, where members of the department's top staff gathered to play horseshoes. Wallace preferred a vigorous game of badminton. To tell the truth, I guess I'm not old enough, he said, for horseshoes. I still prefer something with a bit of life in it. Hambidge recalled an afternoon he and Wallace played 5 hard games. Then, with his hair mussed and his business trousers smeared with a greenish-white mess as a result of a fall, Wallace sat down for a rest. We fell to talking about white rats, wrote Hambidge. Rats were fundamentally important to scientific research, Wallace mused. But what if the rats themselves were not standard? Wouldn't genetically unequal rats give unequal results? Perhaps there should be a critical genetic study of the principal colonies used in our big laboratories, Wallace said. And just as suddenly as he had turned to rats, Wallace bade Hambidge goodbye and left. Badminton and white rats, friendly and abrupt, such was Wallace at age 50. But of course it is not Wallace, the complex intellectual, or Wallace, the energetic badminton player, who is primarily remembered today. It is Wallace, the politician, brave, idealistic, unorthodox, and sometimes highly controversial, who continues to fascinate people interested in American history. Beginning in 1933, when he joined Franklin Delano Roosevelt's cabinet, and continuing for almost 2 decades, Wallace came to symbolize activist, internationalist liberalism for millions of people around the world. His call for a century of the common man became one of the most famous and admired speeches of his generation. But his visionary courage had a price. The big city bosses, the Southern segregationists, and the party regulars could not stomach him. And in 1944, they conspired to dump Vice President Wallace from the ticket and replace him with the more dependable Harry S. Truman. Wallace, of course, did not go quietly. He went to the Democratic Convention in 1944, and he slugged it out, fighting for his cause against enormous odds. The high point of his battle was a valiant speech he delivered seconding Roosevelt's nomination to run for a 4th term, again from our book, American Dreamer. Then came Henry Wallace's moment. Dressed in a gray, double-breasted suit, his hair for once neatly trimmed, Wallace looked every bit the mild-mannered intellectual. Only 16 years had passed since he gave his first awkward political speeches on behalf of Al Smith before small knots of Iowa farmers. Now he stood in Chicago Stadium before a crowd of 30,000 people, and he briefly savored their cheers. And then he let fly. Quote, "The strength of the Democratic Party has always been the people, plain people like so many of those here in this convention, ordinary folks, farmers, workers, and businessmen along Main Street. The future belongs to those who go down the line unswervingly for the liberal principles of both political democracy and economic democracy, regardless of race, color, or religion. In a political, educational, and economic sense," he said, "there must be no inferior races. The poll tax must go. Equal educational opportunities must come. And the future must bring equal wages for equal work, regardless of sex or race." The speech was electrifying. Chicago Stadium roared back its approval with the most genuine ovation given any speaker at the convention. In 15 crisp paragraphs, during which he used the word liberal and liberalism 11 times, Wallace had thrown down his gauntlet. He had stood stiff-necked before the convention delegates and told them forthrightly, what was at stake. It was a blunt, brave, tactless,